We have a fantastic panel that is going to be introduced by Nada Alameddine on the topic of internationalizing concepts. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Nada.
Good afternoon. And today on my panel we have Daniel Del Olmo, President International DineEquity, Ryan Hattingh, Managing Director D.Ream, Jason Myers, Founder, CEO of Busaba, Eathai, and Gaurav Singha, Founder and CEO of Insignia Worldwide and Circadian Interior Design. Welcome. So the panel is about internationalizing concepts. Creating a hospitality concept, being it a hotel, a restaurant, a spa, that appeals to a wide market is already a challenge. So making this concept attractive on the international level is definitely a complex task, taking into consideration the cultural and societal differences. We at Hodema have most of our clients asking us to develop concepts that will be implemented in various parts of the world. So we know for a fact that a lot of effort in research and development is needed. But other steps are also crucial to the success of an international brand. So I would like to share with you, with us your experiences and tips. So if I start with Daniel, you have more than 3,600 Applebee's and IHOP restaurants in 20 countries, which makes DineEquity one of the largest full-service restaurant companies in the world. So what advice can you give us on do's and don'ts while internationalizing concepts?
So what I was saying is that international is a really big misnomer. Yeah. I think that it's a very easy catch term for a lot of companies that are based in markets, particularly like the US or other big expansion markets like the UK. But in all reality, it's a very complex environment, and I cannot think of very successful brands that have gone global that haven't really thought about how to be successfully at a local level. And so for us, I think the do's on how to be successful internationally is first and foremost, listen to the markets. And that sounds incredibly simple, but it is an undertaking. When you're in 20 countries, we've been international with IHOP for 36 years and with Applebee's for over 25 years now. And we actually have been here in the Middle East for over 20 years. And one of the things that we did, I think, not successfully years ago was not listen to the market. And I can share some stories about that later. But over the last 2 years, before even building our 5-year plan in terms of growing in the international markets, we started by doing the largest ever consumer research study across 6 key countries where we are penetrated currently for about 80% of our portfolio. We have about 250 restaurants outside of the US. A few of those countries represent the majority of our presence today and in the future. And we decided to do a very in-depth, both qualitative and quantitative research study to find out what is the market really telling us about our penetration, our preference, our awareness in each one of the markets. And one of the key things that we found out was that we were lacking an emotional connection. Now, with everything that we heard this morning from the presenters like Michael, where it's all about experiences, when you think about a lot of the US brands that are in the casual dining space that have been around for a long time, they've been primarily focused on the functional side of the equation and not on the experiential side of the equation because, as we heard earlier by Sarah, there's a big maturity in the US market. So as a result, the requirement is more about footprint and not about experiences. So I think knowing the market, understanding, listening to the needs of both the consumer on one end and or franchise partners, because the majority of our business around the world, 99.9% is franchise driven, is all about figuring out how you provide the right return equation to your partners, listen to your consumers, and then adapt and tailor your product accordingly. And so over the last 2 years, we've been evolving our brands to the point where now We have a completely evolved brand on the Applebee's and IHOP side, where we've adjusted all of the product, place, promotion, people aspect, and it's paying off in significant dividends in terms of development. We have more development going on today than ever before. We have 200 restaurants in the pipeline, so easily we'll be looking at doubling our business over the next 5 years, and now we're looking at the next step.
Okay, great. Ryan, your company as well has more than 40 brands under its umbrella, and the latest one being Nusrat that opened in Dubai. Now, Nusrat is a concept which is evolving around a chef, and we can see that he's present most of the time at the outlet here in Dubai. So how is it going to happen when we're going to be replicating and having another Nusrat somewhere else in the world to have that interaction experience between the clients and Nusrat himself?
I think that's going to be the challenge with the chef-led brand. The good thing with Nusrat is he's got a very good energy and a lot of it. So he manages to fly around, and he's here every week. He comes in on a Wednesday or Thursday and he leaves on a Sunday, Monday. And he spends a lot of time with his customers. And I think if you look at him specifically, it's a very interesting model, because there is no model. And the model is Nusrat. And he's grown up in the business. He's been in it since he was 12 years old. And he works the business, every element of the business, which contrary to what everybody else believes, this man really and truly owns that business. He owns the customers, he owns the experience, he owns the service. And when he's not in the restaurant, his presence is still felt, because he has such a strong intrinsic belief in what he does. You know, so the DNA runs through the brand, coming from him. You know, we won't be rolling out 3,000 of them. So I think it'll be an easier sort of expansion, if you like, because it'll only be a couple in the bigger cities that we believe we will fit in and that we can manage. But, you know, he has 280,000 Instagram followers. So I think people know and love him and love the brand and love what he's doing. Okay.
So you think that the expansion plan of a concept like Nusrat versus an IHOP or an Applebee cannot be that aggressive because it's linked to a chef?
Unfortunately not. You know, he's still, even in Dubai, he still chooses every cut of meat. He's in Istanbul, he goes in the morning, twice a week, at 6 o'clock to the butcher's. He does the same thing here. He orders his meats, you know, 2 or 3 weeks that he holds it, he ages it himself. And yeah, he loves it. He loves the brand. He loves what it does.
Okay, all right. So if we go to Jason, at Busaba Eathai, you have a winning formula. My question to you, is it because it is linked to Thai food, which is basically very much linked to the healthy trend? Or is it just like the casual segment that you are tapping on, the limited, the simple menu that you have?
Well, I think it's probably both. I think there's a time, you know, for brands and for food, and I think Thai at the minute is one of the fastest growing categories, not just in the UK but in the world. I think there's more people travelling to Thailand than ever before, and we heard one of the speakers earlier today give a fantastic speech on how cool Bangkok is, and you know, I totally concur that, you know, it's one of the fastest growing culinary destinations in the world, and I've been going a lot recently, obviously, with my job. And there's some really interesting things there. So I think health is important. I think there's a time, but interesting, if you look at the global statistics, I won't quote the world ones because it's really difficult to get world restaurant stats. Perhaps somebody can help us in the room, because trying to piece it all together is really tricky. But if you look at the UK, the casual dining sector is tiny compared to the States, but it's about 5 billion. So in casual dining, if you consider that the Pan-Asian category, which we sit in, is worth about 330 million, and half of that is owned by one brand, which is Wagamama's, which historically was created by our same founder as well. I wasn't the founder, sadly, but it's a really amazing restaurateur called Alan Yao, who's created brands like Hakkasan, etc. Yeah. But I think when you look at it, it's growing at around 15% a year when the other category is actually pretty flat. So I think there's a time in motion at the minute for Asian food in the category. And I think Thai fits really well with that, and I think there's a lot of interest in that. And I think also the diversity, the complexity of the food and the flavour profiles are sitting really well, and it cuts across a lot of different countries and cuisines and religions as well. So I think if you're sensitive towards how you use the produce, what you work with the flavour and the culinary direction that we've got, I think it's generally really scalable. So I think it's an exciting time for Thai food.
All right, good. So with all those concepts expanding around the world, we cannot make it without marketing as being a key element in launching any concept in a new market. So Gaurav, my question to you is, to what extent does marketing really affect the success of a brand that wants to be present on the international market? And what are the challenges you face in each market?
Thank you, Nada. All very valid points. And my view on the brand story, so to say, whether it's a Thai restaurant, a Nusrat, or IHOP at a sort of mass number of 3,000 odd restaurants, whatever else, the first principle in building a powerful F&B proposition, in my opinion, is that a great culinary concept has to transcend the cuisine. You have to stand for something more than the food. And I think this is one of the most important aspects when people talk about, we are going to expand up, restaurants, we're going to go into different markets, and we're going to be culturally connected, which I find as two very chubby, hollow words. So culturally connected is everyone's culturally connected, but nobody's really culturally connected. Yeah. And I think this is something where we would like to, this is where effective marketing is. How do you make your brand community embedded, not necessarily culturally connected? That means how do you take your brand story outside of the kitchen and the four walls where you're serving your guests? And I think this comes back to what the previous panel we were talking, listening to gentlemen from Noma, same thing about how do you humanize that story and how do you take that further? And contrarian to the internationalization word, we marketeers tend to fall culprit to sort of jargonistic language, but glocalization is one of those terms. Is how do you take a global proposition and make it local? And the reality is, for every 10 great stories we hear about, there are 50 failed ones also, which we don't talk about. And I think restaurateurs have to be very cognizant of that. So how do you create what I call industrialized F&B, and how do you actually make it a human story? And I think this is a challenging aspect. It's not about just necessarily the institutionalization of process. It is also about the humanization of the story and connecting to the local community. Now, this requires a very good platform of, I always say great logic makes great magic. So to a certain degree, you need to understand your consumer segment. One of the mistakes a lot of restaurateurs can fall prey to is trying to be many things to many people. And, they need to narrow their focus and stay true to their mission. And I think this is a very important aspect from a segmentation point of view, understanding your customer needs. Like, give you an example just close to home in Dubai. We talk about our language is very lethargic when it comes to marketing. It's like, what's our strategy for the restaurants on the Palm or in Sheikh Zayed Road or in the IFC or somewhere else? And I think if you start looking at it from a consumer segmentation point of view and you start looking at psychographic profiling, then you'll find there are at least 30 F&B districts in Dubai. And your strategy on the other side of the road of Sheikh Zayed has to be very different from the other side of the road. Exactly. So I think understanding consumer segmentation and their psychographic needs, because you can't have a strategy for Indians on Asian food. It's a flawed proposition. So I think that level of microscopic evaluation of the segment is very important to build your brand story and make sure you take your message to market. And I think these local nuances are the most critical component of everything, and I think this is where we need to align focus and make sure that there is momentum behind what you're doing, because a lot of F&B propositions and restaurateurs, I also think you don't need an F&B strategy or your marketing strategy or brand. You need a F&B marketing program, because what you also need to do is have the stamina to survive the year, not just about, we will do an epic event, we will launch the venue, And I think if you see, it's happening now with a lot of innovative new restaurant concepts that are coming into the market, where whether the operator is deeply embedded in the narrative. I believe to a certain degree that the anti-marketing strategy is the new marketing strategy, because I always think that cool F&B concepts are a discovery. They're not a sales pitch.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Gaurav. Touch basing on some of the points that Gaurav mentioned, specifically on the failures. I'm gonna go back to you, Daniel. So even with all the successes, all the pipeline that you've got with the openings of IHOP and Applebee's, but there are definitely minor failures that happen throughout. So will you be able to share some of your experience with us, and namely basically maybe with Applebee's closing in some of the territories while being a hit in others?
Sure. How many days do we have to talk about all of the mistakes that we've learned from? I think what is critical for a company to continuously grow and be successful, and we've been in business for over 58 years, when we opened our first IHOP in California, is learning from the mistakes. And about 2.5 years ago, I joined this company. And one of my first trips was to the Middle East. And I was invited to Doha, where we have quite a few of our Applebee's restaurants and our IHOPs. And I walk into the first restaurant, which was exactly a copy of our restaurants in Kansas City. So it was 5,000 square feet or 500 square meters. And smack in the middle of the restaurant, there's a bar. And as you know, liquor is not necessarily, we cater to a local audience, and a bar experience is not necessarily something that is welcomed. And so I asked the question of why did we construct a building where 25% of the building cost is put into a place that nobody really would use? And the answer was, well, that's just how we do it around the world. We do exactly the same thing around the world. It's worked in the US, so why don't we keep on doing exactly the same thing? And so it doesn't take a genius to figure out that if you have a restaurant where 25% of your area is not used because of cultural preferences, that you should reevaluate. And to Gaurav's point, I completely agree. It's about thinking truly, what does your global brand stand for? But then as importantly, how does that truly translate locally? And you have to even think about it hyper-locally. So for us, that learning translated into creating a kit of parts for brands where, depending on where you go around the world, in the Middle East, for instance, all of our restaurants are adjusted so that the formats cater to the audiences. And again, that seems, I think, very, very intuitive. The second big lesson is that sometimes the focus is more on opening restaurants as opposed to really setting up a business. And I think of this incredible industry more as a business that is first and foremost built on returns. And this is a tough business. We work really, really hard to get the margins that we all aspire to have on an ongoing basis. And so I think one of the learnings that we had in going into many markets over the last 35 years is that unless you have a business plan and you have the right partner that you team up, so you have a clear understanding of how you approach the launch of your restaurant brand and your restaurants over the next couple of years, and that truly requires strategic planning, significant strategic planning, you're not going to be successful, at least not for the long term. So we now mandate and require that every single one of our partners around the world, before we even explore a potential market introduction, works with us jointly and collaborates on a strategic plan that ensures that we've covered all of the key components, whether it's supply chain, which as we all know is complex all around the world, whether it's pricing and the positioning, the proper positioning of what your brand really is going to stand for and how it then caters to the local audiences.
Okay, thank you. So going back to Ryan, Koya is as well another brand under the company's umbrella. It is now present in Miami, London, and Dubai. So what do you think is the golden rule when you want to be really implementing a concept in a market like Dubai? Such a concept.
Just to add on to what everybody else has said, probably the most important element from my perspective is the people. And if you don't have the people, as in the staff, that are buying into the concept and that own the concept, you'll never succeed. I think one of the strengths that Zuma Koya have is that they have a core cocktail list, for example, and a core menu that you'll find in any of the restaurants. But then there's a percentage that gets localized, and be it 20, 30, whatever percent. But it's localized by the people on the ground. So they have a huge sense of ownership in terms of the service, in terms of the menu, in terms of everything. And that ownership puts a great international brand into a local forum. And I think allowing, it's very difficult because it's a very fine line. And trusting your staff and allowing them the autonomy to localize the brand to whatever level you decide to. Dubai is a typical example. I think makes the difference and makes a huge difference to the ownership that they have and the fact that they're an outpost in a different country, but they still take it and feel part of the development. And I think the people ultimately are what make or break the brand.
Okay. So basically we're hearing here lots about market penetration, understanding the culture, adapting business models, and so on. So if we're gonna look at the future expansion plan for you, Jason, what are you planning to do in order to ensure that you'll be successful in new markets that you are planning to expand your brands into?
Well, predominantly we're expanding the UK right now, and I think one of the learnings was when I took over the business had developed another brand which we weren't ready to do. We were trying to open in too many different countries. They'd signed franchise partnership arrangements with 3 or 4 different countries, which I stopped immediately, and the only one that we committed to do and follow through was Dubai. Because I think there's a scalability to a business, and I think you've got to get your infrastructure, you've got to get everything in place. So I've gone from running 190 stores, when I was here with Jumeirah, to multiple brands in 30 different countries, to running something incredibly focused that we have to grow and build for the future. And I think you've got to be really realistic as well about the brand. And I think mid-casual dining brands are launching really badly internationally. And I think the reason for that, I think Ryan's touched on it, is people's one of the elements, but it's about your partnership. And the ultimate thing is the reason why the one in Dubai has worked for us is because I've ended up moving 12 colleagues from London to come and run it. Not because there isn't people here that can run it, but when you're trying to create a concept that's not just around about building walls that looks the same, creating food that tastes the same, it's about an ethos and a culture and about creating a movement when you're trying to break into a cluster, into an area. And I see so many brands, and I think one of the most successful launches in the region while I was here was in Dubai Mall, and it was Cheesecake Factory. So whether we like it or not, it was phenomenally successful in terms of turnover, and lots of people had lots to say about it. But the owner came over and actually personally ran it himself for 6 months. And I think, we all forget that. And, the other brands that come into the region, you have to invest. Some brands, particularly QSRs, burgers and pizzas, I'm not saying it's easy, I'm not saying it's harder, I'm just saying it's different. You have a different kind of discipline to running these brands. And what I've certainly learned from running international brands and franchising and partnerships is that really if you're in casual, you've got to be in a committed partnership. Because I think of the effort that we're putting into every store we're opening in London, we're opening Liverpool on Friday, I get back, we've just opened Manchester, and I've got another 14 that we're due to open in the next sort of 18 months. And the effort going into this is absolutely, 7 days a week, full on. Yeah. And you just expect that you can sign a deal with somebody, 7 hours away on a flight, and they launch it with a manual and everything's perfect. And I think there's this inertia about you can buy brands and invest into them and, you know, throw the right kind of looking people in them and kind of build them the same way. And it's just so much more than that. And all the stuff that Gaurav was talking about, I totally concur with. You know, it's really hard to open in your own backyard. It's 10 times harder to go and open somewhere else. And I think you've got to be really honest with yourself. Are you really geared up for that? You know, to open 200 stores worldwide, I mean, that's, you know, you have to build up to that over many, many years and learn from your experiences and work it out. So I think I've certainly learned a lot from this experience, and it's about doing less, but doing it well and backing and committing and seeing it through and making sure that you're with the right partner, because the other thing is that a lot of investors don't realise is that restaurants don't just make profit from day one. Everybody's talking in particular here about how much turnover these restaurants are making. But let's talk about how much profit they're making with phenomenally massive rents here, as big as rents as anywhere in the world. You've got restaurants turning over for millions of dollars that are making loss. And you know, we've got to be really serious about the commerciality. So we do what we call the hockey stick effect. You launch, you lose money, you then curve out, you lose money, you lose more money before you start to make money. And I think we've, as an industry, have got to be a lot more honest with investment, particularly overseas, about this hockey stick effect of growth and how you come out the other side, because this is a long-term commitment, and it's, you know, we all do it, and everybody who stood on this panel today, what struck me is the passion that we have. It's our sector, we love it, we're passionate, we love food, we love what we do. You know, we talked about cultural movements and lots of things today. We have to also, we're in a room full of people talking about investing into us. We have to be really managing that expectation and make sure we've got the right partners to come on that journey. And I think, you know, where the guys have done that on a big scale, it works really, really well, but it's a long-term commitment.
Yeah. Now, looking at the different profiles of the restaurants, we're seeing more and more restaurants opening in hotels, like Koya, Nusret, Hakkasan, and so on. So my last question to you, Gaurav, is what is the role of the restaurant in the context of a great hotel, and how do you brand that story?
Okay, I think this is a you know, very interesting phenomena that is very relevant to this part of the world. My first sort of thought on this is that great hoteliers don't always make great restaurateurs. That's the first rule. We've seen that because we've seen a lot of F&B concepts launched by hotel companies which have not necessarily caught the imagination of the market, that, let's say, the way independent brands have. So I think point number one is that I think we need to learn that hoteliers actually also don't know how to think small. You know, everything is big. I want to be the best, the biggest, and the largest in whatever I do. And I think there's a great opportunity, a positive, disruptive opportunity that resides in how hotels and F&B interact as two principal components of a guest experience. You know, I question why we need all-day dining, you know, as a concept, but the law says you must have it. So I think there are regulatory issues which also need to be addressed as to what makes the classification system in hospitality what it is. So I think there is a bigger, deeper discussion to be had at a legislation level on what the guest experience needs to be promised. But, you know, I question this in the times we live in, why the large buffet at 9 in the morning seems like it's got to be the guest's last meal of his life, sort of an experience. It doesn't need to be. You can have an artisanal cafe which says you pick up your sandwich, juice, and smoothie and whatever else with the lifestyles that we live, and you can actually, that impacts your bottom line, that impacts your operating costs, and there's a number of these things. So I think, you know, F&B generally is, in the context of hotels, needs to drive more change, and I think this is a very important aspect, and I'm very glad to see it happening with independent operators coming on board. Hoteliers have woken up to the fact that they have to lease spaces, not just operate every experience themselves. We've seen it, you know, 10 years ago, there was no independent restaurateur, you know, running like Koya was not here in the Four Seasons. So I think there's a great opportunity to invite. I think hoteliers need to be more welcoming to independent operators coming and allowing them to take over that space. And the first rule here is that hoteliers also need to understand that they are curators of experiences. They're not creators of experiences. And in that, if they were to just change, gear in that thinking, suddenly it's really relevant to have Busaba, Koya, Nusrat in that conversation of the guest experience. They don't have to own it. They have to own the experience they're offering to the guest. So I think this is a very interesting time. I think hoteliers have recognized that leasing space is a clever way of also unhinging the risk associated with a large capex associated with running a big hotel. And that's really my core point. I think F&B is an integral part, and I think hoteliers need to embrace the fact that the guest experience is evolving. You don't need 24-hour room service. Like I've some great stories where restaurants and hotels have collaborated together, where the person, I was actually in Copenhagen last week at a very cool hotel called the SP34, and they had a secret menu which served Frosties and milk at midnight if that's what you wanted. It didn't say you can order a burger. So I think there's a lot of exciting opportunities that we need to embrace, and F&B is going to be a very important part of that story because it allows non-resident footfall into a property, which again comes back to my first point about being community embedded.
Great, thank you so much. So as a conclusion, and after hearing the experiences shared today, we know that internationalizing concept is not an easy task, so a very thorough planning is needed. So thank you, and I think our time is up.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nada. That was fantastic, guys. Great panel. Really, really good.